I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to raise the issue of National Grid's proposals for the Grimsby to Walpole route, which, if realised, will see stretches of pylons constructed across the countryside in Lincolnshire and neighbouring regions. There can be no doubt that this would have a major impact on the environment and economy along the length of the route. My focus today is on the section passing through North East Lincolnshire, though I note the presence of members from other affected constituencies. My honourable friend, the member for Boston and Skegness, led an excellent Westminster Hall debate on the 2nd of May on this matter, and I fully support the concerns that he and others expressed. But such is the level of concern, and to some extent anger of local residents, that I wanted to wait until the opportunity to focus on North East Lincolnshire, and I'm pleased, thanks to Mr Speaker, to have the opportunity today to put on record my own concerns regarding National Grid's proposals. I give way.
Just before the speech, my honourable friend focuses on North East Lincolnshire. He's been very generous in allowing me to intervene to emphasise the case for South Holland and the Deepings, which faces exactly the kind of menace he describes, compromising food security by using valuable agricultural land and blighting the landscape, as well as endangering, in my judgment, the wildlife which is part of the SSSI on the salt marsh on the coast. This must be stopped in the public interest for the common good.
Vickers.
I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention, and as he says, it must be stopped, and that is what I and my constituents want. My concerns reflect those of my constituents, a significant of whom have been in touch with me in recent months to voice their understandable anger and concern at the National Grid plans. The main villages impacted are Brigsley, Ashby-cum-Fenby, Barnwell-by-Lubeck and Waltham. These are attractive traditional villages that face being blighted by monstrous metal structures and cabling. While it not be the legal case, the reality is that the projects of this scale require popular consent if they are to be delivered well. There is no point bulldozing through public opinion. This will breed further resentment and mistrust. There are alternatives, and they must be considered. Decisions such as these are an opportunity for governments to show that the views of local communities do matter, and that there are ways of delivering the much-needed improvements to the grid that take account of those views.
Would my honourable friend allow?
I happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend. I'm further down the East Coast, but I do recognise the problems that he's describing of the impact on North East Lincolnshire. In Suffolk Coastal, and I can see my honourable friend from South Suffolk is also here, we've been concerned for some time about the lack of vision of using new technology in order to avoid the devastation, not just of pylons, but in my own constituency, thinking of Friston, but also Saxmundham, of where converter and other substations would have a truly damaging impact on green fields. And really, we should be doing everything we can to get them onto brownfield sites closer to where the electricity is being used. Now, my honourable friend has indicated that this must be stopped. I would agree with him. I would also suggest that we should at least have a moratorium until the 2025 spatial strategy is ready.
I thank my honourable friend for the intervention, and she's absolutely right. A moratorium is the way forward at the moment. I've attended one of National Grid's consultation meetings and met them privately. It's not ideal that their plans remain rather vague as to the exact route they are planning, and more concrete proposals would be beneficial to all involved. National Grid have also given the impression to some local residents that this is a fait accompli, and I'm sure the Minister will reassure them that is not the case. I want to reassure them that that's not the case. The consultations National Grid are holding within the constituency up and down the country must be meaningful, and they must be certain that members from across the House will ensure that they are meaningful. Infrastructure that transmits electricity. I'll give way to the right honourable friend.
Jenkins.
It's been extremely generous, and I do congratulate him on getting this very timely debate, because what he describes affects Norfolk, Suffolk and Harwich and North Essex in particular, and other Essex constituencies where the government is not considering new technology at the moment. we could have high voltage direct current underground systems, which is the kind of new technology which, for example, in Germany is now the default option instead of pylons, and how we can get that onto the agenda would speed up this infrastructure, because it wouldn't be nearly so controversial and mired in judicial review and courts process.
I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention. And like my other right honourable friend, he highlights the point that there are new technologies available which must be considered before a final decision is taken. Infrastructure that transmits electricity across the country is nationally significant, and we accept that upgrades in one form or another are needed. Expanding the network will indeed lower consumer bills. As my right honourable friend from South Holland and the Deepings noted in the 2nd of May debate, transmission and distribution costs are now roughly 15% of every electricity bill. It will also secure our energy supplies as we decarbonise our energy production in pursuit of net zero. Of course, the most ideal routes from a resident perspective are also, according to National Grid, the most expensive. Building pylons is cheaper than burying cables or taking them offshore. Once you consider that this infrastructure is needed up and down the country, the cost becomes staggering. The government argues that power lines buried underground are up to 10 times more expensive, though I have to say that this is disputed, and that cost often falls onto the bill payer. However, cost should not always be the primary factor in decision making. Governments and their agencies have wider considerations, such as ensuring that the quality of life for its citizens is as pleasant as possible, and they need to carry people with them by seriously considering every alternative and sharing their deliberations with the communities involved. Similarly, I believe that our indirect costs of building pylons that have nothing to do with their construction, but have been imposed as a tool to buy local support. An example of this is the announcement that community benefit schemes to the areas will be provided. This will be funding, although compensation might be a better phrase, for every overhead lines in their area and for every underground cables. The cost of that must be taken into account overall, as indeed the cost for discounts of up to £1,000 has been mentioned for households closest to the new infrastructure. Now, I'm never opposed to local communities being given much needed funding to improve their areas for the benefit of local residents, and of course it's only right that communities are compensated for inconvenience, particularly when it relates to such national significant work. However, these costs will soon add up, and they must be included in calculations. Unfortunately, constraints imposed by government seem to have placed an emphasis in favour of pylons, as opposed to alternatives such as underground and offshore. For much, indeed, as my honourable friend, the member for Bolsover, standing in for the Minister at the debate on the 2nd of May said, overhead lines should be the strong starting presumption. The phrase strong presumption is a loaded statement and does not indicate that full consideration will be given to alternatives. Though he did clarify that flexibility is possible, where there is high potential for widespread adverse landscapes and or visual impacts. Some clarity on high potential and widespread means here, given I think many communities will have a valid case to say that both terms apply to developments in their area. I'd happily give way.
I thank him for giving way on the debate that I called in Westminster Hall, and I welcome the contribution of many members in that. Does he agree with me that the Minister rightly expressed that there is a huge amount of real feeling on our constituents' behalf, and it is right that the government should listen to that, and that this process needs to consider those feelings, and perhaps we should ask whether it should be paused while they are taken fully into account?
I agree with my honourable friend that whether we call it a pause or a moratorium, we do need to stop and reflect on where we have arrived at. I hope that the Minister in his reply will confirm that although planning guidance contains an assumption in favour of pylons, Full consideration of the alternatives will be put before ministers. First, I believe the proposals are short-sighted and incoherent in terms of obvious necessity to rewire the grid to make it fit for the future and ensure we have infrastructure in place to reach net zero. By 2050, the country will require 2 or 3 times the amount of electricity as today. However, in respect of these plans, there is a clear failing of strategy in relation to how we ensure the necessary infrastructure. Secondly, my constituency is largely a rural one, as in Lincolnshire more broadly, and there are significant regional concerns regarding the impact of erecting pylons on prime agricultural land and what this will mean for our food security. In fact, when it comes to this land, even underground wiring is not ideal, given the disruption this may cause. We are fortunate to benefit from an ever-increasing amount of electricity generated from offshore wind farms, and my constituency is fortunate to be on the Humber Estuary, which is a leading force in the renewable energy sector. This presents an opportunity for an offshore grid transmitting much of our electricity away under the sea. Of course, at some point the electricity will have to come on land, but this will significantly reduce the need for pylons and overhead cables. We can learn here from examples in Belgium and Denmark. I want to conclude by delivering a few messages to the relevant stakeholders. To National Grid, I reiterate my previous remarks to them, where I stress that they must consider the impact of residents in the nearby villages before making any decisions and look to mitigate the impact to the visual environment to the greatest extent. I, like many of my colleagues, am in favour of extensive underground and undersea sections rather than utilising open countryside, and I desperately hope that this will be taken on board. In this regard, I was encouraged by the Prime Minister's reply to me on the 20th of March. He said, referring to me, he will recognise the balance we need to strike by making sure that we give our country the energy security it needs, but in doing it in a way that is respectful of the impact on local communities. I will make sure that ministers take into account the concerns he raised and that all views of local constituents are taken into account. I repeat, I was encouraged by what the Prime Minister said in that reply. I don't want to make this speech too political. However, given the ultimate decision on this matter is unlikely to be taken until next year and consequently after the election, so my message to whoever sits on the Treasury bench and is responsible for deciding this matter is that I and my Conservative colleagues will not let this matter rest. The proposals as they stand will not get my support. Finally, to the Minister. The Government has set out ambitious but sensible environmental targets. If we are to achieve these targets to reduce emissions, we will need to produce more electricity. And clearly that means that the additional infrastructure is indeed required. But we must protect our visual environment. I appreciate that ministers can't preempt what National Grid's final recommendations are and mustn't prejudge issues, but they will have to determine it in the future. And I hope Minister will ensure that the views of my constituents, as well as others across the House, are front and centre in this process, and the wider impact on the environment and economy of North East Lincolnshire that I'm privileged to represent will be taken seriously. I can assure my constituents that their voice will be heard and that I know my colleagues will fight any proposals that have a detrimental impact on the communities. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Much. Justin Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is a real pleasure to respond to the final adjournment debate of this Parliament. And yes, and earlier today, respond to the final Westminster Hall today. I have literally been doing the washing up. And in the spirit of the tributes that we have been paying today to our soon-to-be departed colleagues, I just want to briefly pay tribute to my very dear friend, the Honourable Friend for Brigham Gould, who, whilst he claims, Mr Deputy Speaker, that his proudest moment was the looped Sky News footage of him carrying my Honourable Friend for Holton Price's bag, I disagree. I would say he is one of our finest performers at the dispatch box and one of our strongest performers in the media and in debates. I made that very clear to each and every one of the Chief Whips and Prime Ministers at various reshuffles, and it is a great loss that our party underused him, and he will be sadly lost in the future. Now, turning to this incredibly important debate, Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank my honourable friend for Cleethorpes for raising this issue, which I know is of importance to not just his constituency, his region, and across many, many areas of Great Britain. And I can assure you, as a minister, I have been lobbied heavily by so many colleagues on this very important issue. Now, an expanded electricity network is critical to lowering consumer bills, securing our energy supply, delivering green growth, skilled jobs, and decarbonising our electricity system. Nobody denies this. But this must be delivered in a strategic and sensitive way, which considers and mitigates impacts on communities and our treasured landscapes. And I thank all present for their contributions today.
I thank the Minister very much for giving way. The offshore wind grid will come in through at Grimsby West substation and it will skirt around the Great Grimsby constituency. But residents are very, very concerned that this goes through beautiful countryside, passing by the area of outstanding natural beauty. Does he understand the concern that people have that if this was perhaps in another area of the country, that we wouldn't be being ridden roughshod over as much as we feel that we are in North East Lincolnshire as a whole?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend has championed the voice of a community, and I am coming on to specifically the importance of residents' concerns, and we all recognise this is an important subject for communities. My Secretary of State and I are clear that community voices must be heard in our transformation of the electricity system. And our Prime Minister has made clear we are making the transition to net zero in a way that supports communities and families. This is true for new electricity infrastructure and the organisations which plan and deliver this infrastructure that are working to ensure this. And members here will be under no illusion that to bring new homegrown electricity onto the system, we must expand the electricity network considerably, rewiring from where new generation is being built in our wind-rich seas and new coastal nuclear sites and connecting it to areas of demand. We also anticipate that by 2050 we will need to meet double the current level of demand, and we need an efficient, high-tech electricity network to transport that power from where it is generated to where it is needed to drive our country forward. Now, the government is acutely mindful of the potential visual impacts of electricity transmission infrastructure, particularly overhead lines on communities. And that has been the theme raised by members, whether it's through parliamentary questions, whether it is through tonight's adjournment debate or the recent Westminster Hall debate. And as it stands, whilst the use of undergrounding is the starting presumption in nationally designated areas, that is to say in national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty, to protect these landscapes, overhead lines are the strong starting presumption. But this, in theory, remains flexible, and undergrounding may be used in other areas in certain circumstances, namely where there is a high potential for widespread adverse landscape and or visual impacts. Such decisions will be weighed up through the planning process. However, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State and I are mindful of the constructive challenge of the colleagues, whether individually, whether as part of their different subgroups. In fact, Offset is one of those groups, and on my first day in the department, I thought that was just another WhatsApp group I hadn't been invited to join. But in fact, it was a powerful group of Conservative colleagues seeking to make sure their communities' voices were heard. And on the back of this, only this week, I met with my honourable friend for South Suffolk, who has a detailed and extensive knowledge of future opportunities that could and should be considered. And we had a deep dive discussion around the presumption that overhead cables should be the strong starting presumption, which in simple terms, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is based on a cost as per the ESO figures in 2012. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sure that you would recognise that since 2012 there's been significant advancements in new technology. As mentioned, Germany has already made UDC as the default. The ESO's own recent figures for the East Anglia study suggested that if you consider lifetime costs, that's not just the upfront costs, but the potential for long-term lower constraint costs, and also challenges around delivery speed, each and every one of those variables raised important questions. And we cannot, with certainty, answer whether those questions are valid or not, because the data simply does not exist. And it is right and proper, if we are going to let communities' voices be heard, being championed by my honourable friends on the benches behind me, they would expect, at the very least, we have those answers, not just to protect their communities, to make sure that we are delivering on our commitment that as we race towards our net zero targets, we will do so by lowering consumer bills, because you have to take the public with you or you lose everything. So at that meeting, we were mindful to explore how we could carry out an urgent review to consider these variables, challenging those long-standing presumptions. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, you may have noticed there was an announcement this week that may delay what we had hoped would be an urgent review. And I would say clearly, whoever is the minister when we return, and whoever is the government, they need to make sure they get the facts. This review is an opportunity to make sure communities' voices have been listened to and that we are championing best value for money for bill payers. That is something that I support, I will continue to do, and if I am fortunate enough...
Andy Percy.
I thank him for giving way. He was very generous about me at the start. What he missed out, of course, in his generosity was that one of the biggest privileges I had this Parliament was, of course, living with him for a period as his flatmate, which, I was the clean one, just to be absolutely clear. But the Minister is a really great friend, but also a very, very good Minister and a really decent chap. In terms of what he's said, and obviously my two colleagues here in particular from Northern Lincolnshire are fantastic champions for our area on this issue, and everybody else as well. Of course, in broader Lincolnshire, I was talking about Northern Lincolnshire, but actually the point he makes there at the end is the really important one here, which is that constituents feel this is something that's been done to them, and that they also they understand that we must absolutely increase our grid capacity, but it must be done in a way that makes it feel that they've had their voice and that it's not been done to them, and that every single option of how we do this has been considered.
Thank my honourable friend, and he has summed up exactly the point of this, and it is a tribute to each and every one of my colleagues who have been constructive, they've engaged in a pragmatic way, and rightly, whoever is in my position when we return after the election should take forward this opportunity to review to make sure communities' voices are heard and we deliver those cheaper community.
I really appreciate what my honourable friend is saying, and I think the Minister is showing great wisdom, even though he's been in the role for a relatively short time and has grasped the particular issues. There are, candidly, there are problems in that connections are still being offered for stations that haven't even been granted planning permission. But the key point I wanted to make to the Minister is before he leaves office, and he will continue being a minister until at least after the decision of the electorate on who will form the next government. But it is about those processes which are currently in the middle of the consultation process and in the middle of the planning process. Would he please make every effort, he and the Secretary of State, to make sure that members of Parliament will not lose their voice in this consultation process, and that, if necessary, the Planning Inspectorate be instructed to add time to recognise the election period that's underway.
I thank my honourable friend, who was an absolute wonderful boss when I had the pleasure of serving under her stewardship in the DWP in a former role, and I think she's made her plea crystal clear, and I hope common sense is applied, as in effect things are paused during a general election process, and in whatever format and whoever is the decision maker, they should always be mindful of community engagement. And it comes back to that core point. This review gives an opportunity to get up-to-date facts, recognising modern technology, recognising the lessons that can be learned from Germany, recognising lifetime costs, so we can ultimately be confident we are doing our best to deliver cheaper consumer bills, crucial not just for living costs, but also to make sure we carry the public with us on net zero.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for his endorsement of offset, and it's very encouraging to find that we've had a bit of influence. But can you just be clear, is this background work going to be carried out and continued during the general election period, so it's ready for an incoming minister, whether it's himself returning to office or another minister?
Minister?
As tempting as it is to bind a future government, I can't. But I know that my policy teams felt that it was important to look at those principles, but I can't bind future governments. But what I can do, and I will be doing, is making sure I'm part of the process post the general election. Thank you, Mrs. Speaker.
This is the last adjournment debate. Congratulations to Martin Vickers and Justin Tomlinson for the last adjournment debate. And also, they say there is nothing like a dame. Well, there is. There's two dames. And two dames I've worked alongside for the past 4.5 years, which is Rosie Winterton and Eleanor Lang. Two dames. And they've been absolutely superb. We've worked as an incredible team, along with Sir Lindsay Hoyle, who has been the best speaker that I have ever worked under or alongside. He's been absolutely superb, along with Sir Roger Gale, who's given us some tremendous support over the past several months. And I just have to say, what an emotional time this is, because I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, whether I'll get in the chair or not. So I just wanted to put on record my grateful thanks to all of them. And Sergeant, can you pass on all my grateful thanks to the staff who've looked after us for the last 4.5 years, ensuring that our democracy has continued in the way that it has. The question is that the House do now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye? Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.